تقول لا تنمي هذه أنوار ذي سلمي عن قليل أنت في الحرم عند خير العرب والعجم
قف أمام القابر بالأدب
أيها
أعوذ بالله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الفاتحة بنية التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير، النفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة، والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله، والدعاء على الهدى والدلالة على الخير، ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. وعلى ما نوى نبينا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم، وعلى ما سبنا صالحون، وعلى ما نوى المؤلف الرحيم أحمد بن زين الحبشي، وعلى ما شيخنا حبيب محمد سبحانه وتعالى شيخنا غير خيرتنا في نياتهم، وأعمالنا في أعمالهم، وأخلاقنا في أخلاقهم، وطريقتنا في طريقتهم القبول. وإلى حضرة النبي سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. سر الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. رب اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق الهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله وصحبه قابل إليه مقدار العليم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت الحكيم. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. So inshallah this week we will go this week we will continue with what do you call this? Hajj. We had the Hajj and Umrah in Risalah al-Jami'ah by Habib Ahmad bin Zain al-Habshi, the great Imam Shafi of his time, the great wali and scholar. رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به في الدارين آمين. Okay, so last week we already covered the conditions of obligation, the shurut wajib, of Hajj, i.e. the conditions that need to be fulfilled before Hajj is considered wajib on someone, right? And the conditions or the parameters or the definition of what constitutes ability, right, which is the other condition. Okay, so if condition Hajj, the obligation of Hajj is conditional on the ability, one's ability to go, and that ability has certain conditions, okay, which when fulfilled, then one is considered to have the ability to go for Hajj. We've already done that last week, inshallah. So this week we're going to just cover the different kinds of actions in the Hajj, right, and cover the first, touch on the first integral of the Hajj, right, and then move on to an overview of the other integrals of Hajj. Okay, so we carry on in the text to where Habib Ahmad bin Zain carries on, and he goes on to say, وأعمال الحج ثلاثة أشياء: أركان وواجبات وسنن. فالأركان خمسة: الإحرام وهو نية الدخول في الحج أو العمرة، ويستحب أن يقول مع ذلك نويت الحج أو العمرة وأحرمت به لله تعالى ولا يصح. Okay, so the works of the Hajj are of three kinds. So all the works of the Hajj, right, can be broken down into three types. Okay, the obligatory integrals, the fard, or the rukun, the requisites, right, which are the wajibat, the wajibs, and the sunnahs of Hajj. Okay, so now this okay, wajib and fard, usually in the Shafi'i madhab, there is no difference between the two, between wajib and fard, except in the topic of in the chapter or in the section or addressing pilgrimage. Okay, except in the context of the Hajj, right, and the Sunnah and the Umrah. Sorry. Okay, so in this case, the non-performance of a wajib does not invalidate the pilgrimage. Right, the pilgrimage, the Hajj, the Umrah is still valid, but necessitates an expiation, fidyah. Okay, and it is a sin if it is done without an excuse. Right, so if it's left, a wajib is left without an excuse, then the one who does that is sinful. Okay. On the other hand, the non-performance of a fard or rukun invalidates the Hajj completely. Okay, so if one leaves an integral, an obligatory integral, right, which is what I have translated of fard or rukun to be, if one leaves that, then the Hajj is invalidated. Yeah, but not if one leaves a wajib, a requisite. So this is the only chapter, this was the only context in which the Shafi'i madhab where we differentiate between fard and wajib. So that's one thing to note, to remind, worth reminding again. Okay. So the obligatory so Habib Ahmad bin Zain goes on to describe the actions of the Hajj itself. Okay, after having presented the conditions of obligation and ability. Right, now we move on. So that first of all, there are obligatory integrals, fard or rukun. Right, these are actions whose non-performance invalidates the Hajj, as I've mentioned, and cannot be expiated for. So one cannot make up for them, right, through paying the fidyah, the dam, the fidyah, the sacrifice of a sheep, right, for example. And it prevents one from exiting the state of Ihram. So for as long as one has not done this, one cannot exit the state of Ihram. Okay, we'll go into what the state of Ihram is in a bit. Okay. Second class of actions are the wajibat, the requisites. Okay, in the context of Hajj. So these are requisite actions, right, whose non-performance does not invalidate the Hajj, but right, requires an expiation, right, in the form of fidyah, dam. Okay, so the difference between obligatory integral, right, fard rukun, versus a wajib is that if one leaves the integrals, then one's Hajj is invalidated, and it cannot be expiated for. One cannot just pay the penalty for that. Right, but for the wajib, it does not invalidate. If one does not perform a wajib, one leaves a wajib, it does not invalidate the Hajj, but one is required to pay a penalty. Okay, but and if one leaves the wajib without an excuse, without a valid excuse, and then one is considered to have sinned. Okay, and the third category after the integrals and the requisites, right, are the sunan. The sunan is the plural of sunnah. Okay, so sunnah is the same thing as, in Arabic it is sunan. Okay, so these are actions which do not affect the validity of the pilgrimage of the Hajj or Umrah, and there is no expiation required, even if one leaves them intentionally, right, without excuse. But the non-performance of these sunnahs detract from the perfection or reduce the or scar, make it imperfect. They make the Hajj or the Umrah, they make the pilgrimage less perfect. Right? It reduces the perfection, detracts from the perfection of the pilgrimage. Okay, so later on, later on towards the end of the chapter, he also discusses the prohibitions of the state of Ihram. Right, so we will cover these kinds of actions, and then after that the prohibitions of Ihram. Yeah, so this is what I was talking about. So the works of Hajj are divided into 3 kinds. Okay, so now what is Ihram? Ihram means to make haram what is earlier halal, right? A bit like the, we know the takbiratul ihram, the opening takbir of the prayer, right? After which what was halal before, for example, eating, drinking, talking, then becomes haram. Similarly, for the ihram, there are certain things, 4 or 5 things that become haram, right, after entering into this state. Right? For example, hunting or having relations with one's spouse. Okay, we'll cover that towards the end of this chapter, inshallah. Okay, so the ihram is a state of consecration, a state of sanctity, right? Like when you enter into prayer, it is a state of sanctity, it's a state of sanctity with in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here also we are the guests of Allah. When we enter into ihram, we put on the clothes of the ihram, right? That is entering into a state of consecration. Okay? And this entry into this state is through the intention. So we put on the ihram, usually 2 pieces of white clothing, like one for the lower waist, around the waist, and one for the wrap around the body for men, right? Okay, so the ihram for men and women are a bit different, but we won't cover those things, right, in this chapter. Maybe just touch on it a little bit, but not in depth. So a lot of this chapter I will be going through and I will provide notes to content or element or information that you should query on, you should be aware of and seek to find if you want to get a fuller understanding of the chapter of Hajj or Umrah. Alternatively, as I mentioned several times, I think you can also check out the playlist of Ustaz Abdurrahman Balkhi, who is also on the Al-Wafa channel, who is also teaching Risalah al-Jami'ah, the Essentials of Islam. Okay, he provides a more thorough treatment, okay, of this. Okay, so there are various intentions of performing the Hajj, right? There are various ways of performing the Hajj, depending on which one performs first, whether it's the Umrah first or the Hajj first, or both the Umrah and Hajj intended together. Umrah first and then adds the Hajj onto it. Okay, so the first is the Ifrad, right, where the Hajj is performed before the Umrah. Okay, in fact, it's not wajib to do the Hajj and Umrah in the same year, but if one does the Umrah at another time, then it must be within the Hajj months. Okay, so if one does only Hajj, for example, in this Ifrad way, right, of performing Hajj, one does only the Hajj and then leaves the Umrah. One has to go back, right, return to one's country. Then if one performs Umrah another time, maybe the following year, then it has to be done that for it to count towards the Hajj, it has to be done within the Hajj months. Okay, so Ifrad is performing the Hajj before the Umrah. Okay, on condition that the Umrah is performed in the same year. So it doesn't have to be immediately after, but even if it's performed before the end of Dhul Hijjah, right, in that same month, then it is considered to count towards the Hajj. So this is one of the ways, and this is if the Umrah is performed together with the Hajj, right, i.e. even by the end of Dhul Hijjah, as in within the same year, then this way of performing the Hajj is the best, because there are the most narrations of the Prophet ﷺ having performed it this way. Okay, but if it's not, then it is then the others are preferred over it. Okay, so the second way is the tamattu'. So tamattu' is to perform the Umrah before the Hajj. Okay, thirdly, there is the Qiran, right? Okay, to perform them simultaneously together, to enter Ihram for both Umrah and Hajj, right? Or to enter Ihram for Umrah, and then after that to add to it the intention of the Hajj. Okay, one can also make an unconditional intention, right? So I intend worship, nawaitu haramtu lil nusuk, right? I take the Ihram, I enter into the Ihram for worship lillahi ta'ala. And then later see which one ends up to be which one whether of Hajj or Umrah one ends up performing first is also possible. Okay, so not conditioning the intention on performing, not specifying that I'm going to perform Hajj first or Umrah first, just general intention, and also a conditional intention. So this applies for people who when they follow guides, for example, for Umrah and Hajj, and they forget maybe or they haven't learned the intentions, which is not it's not allowed. So as we mentioned last week, so whatever one wants to set out to do, whatever action, whatever ibadah, whatever worship one wants to set out to do, one is obliged to learn about it. Okay, so in the scenario, for example, you forget the specific intention, then one intends that I intend as Ustaz so and so intends, the one who is guiding them, for example. Okay, so these are the various intentions, okay, in performing Hajj. Okay, and there's wisdom behind these intentions. So for example, the Ifrad intention, so those who arrive for Hajj late, okay, so maybe they arrive before the end or near approaching Arafah, okay, or even during Arafah, right? Then they can intend the Ifrad Hajj so that they can perform the Umrah after the Hajj, okay, i.e. they do the Hajj first and then they do the Umrah. Right. And then maybe some other people maybe have no time to perform the Umrah after the Hajj, so then they can intend the Qiran way of performing Hajj, which is to perform the Umrah and Hajj together. So that means they don't have to perform a separate tawaf, a separate sa'i for Umrah, and then a separate sa'i and tawaf for Hajj, it's combined. Okay, two intentions in one. And then maybe there are other people who arrive in Makkah early, right, and they can do the Umrah first before the Hajj. They have time to do the Umrah first, and so they intend the Tamattu kind of Hajj. Okay, so this is the wisdom behind the differentiation in ways, and this is the wisdom and of course the mercy of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sunnah, because of various ways maybe he performed, he's performed the Hajj, and so it broadens the religion for us and makes it easy for us. Okay, so generally Ifrad would be the best way, right? It's the most superior way of performing Hajj, assuming if on condition that one performs the Umrah within the same year, even if not immediately after. Okay, but otherwise then Tamattu and Qiran are preferred over Ifrad. Ifrad drops down. Muezzin goes on to say it is sunnah to utter the intention. Okay, he specifies nawaitul Hajj, right, or nawaitul Umrah, wa ahramtu bihi lillahi ta'ala. That's the intention. I intend the Hajj or intend the Umrah, and I enter into Ihram on so we've covered this many times already. The intention, the place of the intention, the integral of Ihram, the integral of the intention is in the heart, but to utter it is sunnah. Okay, so for example, as I mentioned, nawaitul Hajj, right, nawaitul Hajja wa haramtu bihi lillahi ta'ala, right, labbaik Allah bi hajjah, right. And so one adds that to it. So if one intends the Hajj, labbaik Allah bi hajjah, right, or if one intends the Umrah, then one adds to the intention labbaik Allah bi Umrah. Okay, and another important thing to note, right, is the condition of release. So the pilgrim can add also a condition of release to the intention. So one adds Allahumma mahilli haythu habastani, right? So that he says that, oh Allah, I become halal, the place of my becoming halal is where I have been prevented, right? Where you have decreed that my Hajj or my Umrah is prevented. I'm going to be prevented from completing it. Okay, so when one does this with this condition, right, if this person is then prevented, for example, from completing his Hajj, then he can exit the Ihram, right, without expiation, without having to pay a penalty. Okay, otherwise he cannot. Okay, so the condition of release is something important to add to the intention, inshallah. So I don't know, the internet connection where I am seems to be not fantastic at the moment, so I'm not sure how well this is going to be streamed. Maybe I should have recorded it instead. I should record it instead. Okay, but I'm trying to go through this rather a bit slower, and we're not covering too much content, so hopefully I'll have a look and figure it out, inshallah. My apologies if the streaming is hanging or anything like that. Okay. Okay, so the miqat zamani is the time for entering ihram. So this is what Habib Ahmad bin Zain goes on to mention. وَلَا يَسِحُ الْإِحْرَامِ بِالْحَجِّ إِلَّا فِي أَشْهُرِهِ. Right, and it's not valid to enter ihram for Hajj except in the Hajj months, like Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah, and the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah. Right, and these end with the entry of Fajr on the day of sacrifice, right, on the day of the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. Okay, i.e. after Arafah, the end of Arafah, right? That's the end of the time for entering into ihram. Okay, so this concept of miqat is the places where one enters into ihram. Okay, so this is another concept that one should bear in mind, that we should take into account, right? And I'm highlighting here. Right, so here what Habib Ahmad bin Zain is talking about is these are the miqat zamani. Okay, so the Hajj months, right? Those months until the end of Arafah, i.e. the entry of Fajr on the next day. And if one intends the Hajj at any point outside of these Hajj months, then what one performs automatically it is considered an Umrah, right, instead of a Hajj. Yeah. Okay, so now an overview of the elements of the Hajj, right, and Umrah. Okay, وباقي الأركان الوقوف بعرفة وطواف الإفاضة والسعي والحلق أو التقصير. So the remaining integrals after the intention or ihram are the standing at Arafah, the going forth circumambulation, tawaf al-ifadah, and the going between the sa'i, the going between Safa and Marwa, and the cutting the hair. Okay, so standing at Arafah involves being present, right, in ihram, right, in some portion of Arafah. Okay. Okay, while being sane and in full possession of one's faculties, right, not insane, not drunk, not inebriated, right, or otherwise not in possession of one's faculties, right? And this must be during the Dhuhr prayer on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah until the entry of Fajr the following day, okay, which is the end of Arafah. Yeah. So even if the pilgrim, this is and to be present in ihram at Arafah, right, even if the pilgrim is on transport, right, transportation, or on an animal, a riding beast, right, or asleep, or just passing by, or not knowing that this land is the land of Arafah, or that the day is the day of Arafah, right, even if all this is the case, that his presence is still counted, okay, towards the standing at Arafah. Okay, but of course it's not valid if it's not the time of Arafah, it's before Dhuhr, for example, on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, or after Fajr on the 10th, or the land is not the land of Arafah, right, not within the limits of Arafah, right, or if one is insane for, or loses one's faculties for a time, right? Although as long as one regains one's faculties before the end of Arafah and is able to enter into ihram, one can still make it. Okay, so this with regards to the standing Arafah. Tawaful Ifadah, the going forth circumambulation, is another integral. Okay, so the there are a few different kinds of circumambulation, few different kinds of tawaf, right? There's the tawaf that we will discuss, inshallah. The tawaf ifada is the going forth circumambulation, which is the integral of a hajj. Right? The tawaf qudum, right? Tawaf al-qudum, the arrival circumambulation, right, is sunnah. Okay, it is a sunnah. It is not an integral. The tawaf wada, the farewell, right, circumambulation is a wajib. It is not an integral. Okay, so the tawaf qudum is a sunnah. The tawaf ifada is a rukun, it's an integral, and the tawaf wada is something, is a wajib, is a requisite. Okay, so the requisite, as I mentioned earlier, the requisite can be expiated for, right? Although it's haram, it's a sin to leave it without excuse, right? But the tawaf wada, which is an integral, cannot be left, must be performed, right? And the tawaf qudum is a sunnah. Okay, as we mentioned, we discussed earlier, and we will discuss the conditions of validity of tawaf later, inshallah. Yeah, so that's the definition of tawaf. Okay, to walk around, walk in certain situations, or jog maybe, okay, around the Kaaba 7 times with certainty, meaning one is sure that one has done it 7 times, and if one is not, then one should add another round to be sure, right, until one achieves certainty. Okay, so one begins from the Hajar al-Aswad, the black stone on one's left, right, and maintains a line with the Kaaba the whole time, and one goes around 7 times, right, from the Hajar al-Aswad. So once, twice, three times, and so on. Okay, beginning and ending there. Okay, so seven rounds, 7 circumambulations is considered 1 tawaf. Okay, next we have the going between, the sa'i between Safa and Marwa. Okay, this one also is 7 traversals, from Safa to Marwa, back, forth, altogether 7 times. Okay, so the sa'i can be performed before the sa'i of Hajj or after, or in fact, I think better leave this part to when we discuss the conditions of validity of sa'i, inshallah. Okay. Okay, so this is what we're doing when we're performing the sa'i, is to go back and forth, right? Sunnah du'as and things to recite at all points of the Hajj, of course, and the Umrah. Okay, finally one exits the state of Ihram, right, by performing the tahallul. So this tahallul is the shaving or the cutting of hair, right? So the minimum number of hair that must be shaved or cut, right, is 3 strands, right? So a minimum of 3 strands, and this minimum, it doesn't only, it can be shaved or cut or plucked or burnt, or and even if the hair is outside of the limit of the head. Yeah, outside of the limit of the head, because when, remember, if we talk about wudu, then we are talking about the hair that must be washed, must be wiped, the portion of the head, the hair that must be wiped must be within the limit of where the hair grows on the head. So in this case, even if it's a long hair, one pulls it out and just snips 3 strands, okay, that is sufficient to exit from the ihram, right, with the intention of exiting from ihram. Okay, so for men it is best to shave completely, right, because one is rewarded with every hair that is sacrificed for tahallul, yeah. And for women it is best to cut. Okay, so these are the remaining integrals, the integrals of the Hajj, right? So for the Umrah, the integrals are the same except for the standing at Arafah. Okay, so for Umrah we don't have the standing at Arafah, yeah, but everything else is the same. Okay, so inshallah next week we'll carry on with we'll go into the wajibat and the conditions and so on. Okay, وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم على ليلة الفتوح والمنوح والرسوخ وصلاح الجسد والروح وتبدأ سبحان الله بسيدنا محمد الفاتحة بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين.
يا ربنا اعترفنا بأننا اقترفنا وأننا أسرفنا على لظى أشرفنا فضلا وجودا منا لا باكتساب منا بالمصطفى الرسول نحظى بكل سول بالمصطفى الرسول نحظى بكل سول بالمصطفى الرسول نحظى بكل سول.